And hello, everybody, and welcome to the Future Laboratories Neo-collectivism macro trend on Zoom. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Martin Raymond. I'm co-founder of the Future Laboratory, which of course is a strategic foresight consultancy. Okay, we specialize in trend analysis, so what's changing in the world and why. Foresight deployment, so how these changes are likely to impact on your brands, businesses, organizations, and then also what we call our strategic implications. So what strategy you and your brand need to embrace to profit from those changes. So as always, we focus on the consumer, which brings me to the whole area of neo-collectivism and Holly Trend, who's the Deputy Foresight Editor of our online trends and consumer insight platform, LSN Global. Holly will be presenting today's trend, but I just wanted Holly to say hello so she can familiarize herself with everybody.
Hi, thank you, Martin. Excited to be here.
It is, just as a quick kind of taster, neo-collectivism, sorry, get the term right, as our title suggests, is about emergent consumer behavior. So it's emergent consumer behavior and how and why the collectivist mindset is increasingly defining our choices as consumers, but also how we do business and create trends. So more on that in a few moments from Holly. But behind the scenes, I'm also joined, if you look on your chat function, I'm joined by Emily Kelly, who's our marketing manager. And Emily is looking at, well, she'll be recording all of your questions and popping details into the chat function so that you can interact with us during the session. So we'll have a little note there from Emily to remind us that she is back online with us. Also, we are joined by LSN Global members who can, of course, or in fact, probably some of you have downloaded the neo-collectivism trend already. So the report sits on the platform. And again, Emily will post a link so that you can access it fairly quickly. Some of you, I think, looking at the chat, have also sent through comments about the Future Laboratory Community Network, which, yes, you can join. And if you're not a member of the network at the moment, I recommend that you check out the link which Emily will post. It is about taking part in a community of like-minded, well, actually, it's unlike-minded people who will be able to challenge, to chat, to collaborate on ideas surrounding the trends we're looking at, but also on some of the bigger themes and issues that we are looking at in the Future Laboratories LSN Global. So just now to hand you over to Holly. And again, if you have questions, post them into the chat while Holly is speaking, and we will hopefully have time to answer some of the questions afterwards. Holly.
Thank you, Martin. So yeah, my name is Holly Friend, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm the Deputy Foresight Editor here at the Future Laboratory, working predominantly on LSN Global. So those of you who are LSN members hopefully will have read some of our work, some of our trends. Some of you, like Martin said, might know neo-collectivism already, might have some questions about it that have been burning since last Thursday. And I'm basically going to take you through a bit of a quick snapshot of what neo-collectivism is. I'm sure many of you are wondering what that term means. You've seen it around, you've seen it in marketing, you've seen it on social media, but what actually is it? So I'm going to unpack that over the next 15 minutes or so. So I'm just going to share my screen and take you through a quick presentation. Great, hopefully that's all working fine. So neo-collectivism is essentially a great reorganization of people. So those of you who know our trends will know that our trends typically fall into one of three buckets. They're either usually consumer-driven trends, they're driven by people who are enacting change and forcing brands and organizations to change alongside them, or they're experience-driven trends. It's about the human experience, it's about the city experience, or perhaps it's a brand trend the actual change is coming from the brand itself. And this, of course, is a consumer-driven trend. It is about what happens when consumers take it upon themselves to make change en masse and don't wait around for the organizations, all the institutions that have held power for so long can do it for them. They can actually take it upon themselves. They have the tools now at their disposal, or maybe it's not tools, but they have each other, because you'll notice throughout the next kind of 15 minutes or so that neo-collectivism is all about what can happen if we act together rather than individually. We've recognized over the last few years now that actually individual micro actions don't ladder up to huge change quickly. Change can be achieved faster if we work together. So that is the underlying basis of neo-collectivism. And those of you who know the Future Lab will know we usually tend to start with a quote to sum up this mindset from one of our key experts. So this is a quote from David Ehrlichman, who's the author of a book called Impact Networks. David says, our ability to form, grow, and work through networks has never been more essential. So we need these networks, and we're seeing the rise of these new consumer collectives and retail alliances, hospitality clubs, and even wealth squads, which are all trends that we look at in the full version of neo-collectivism. And David himself is a bit of a veteran when it comes to collective action. He has an organization called Converge, which basically acts as a catalyst for organizations to fix problems together. So it's about businesses relearning how to collaborate with one another instead of competing, which is something we at the Future Laboratory have been pushing for several years now since our trend Elastic Brands. So before we get stuck into some of the key trends, I just wanted to take you through some of the drivers of neo-collectivism. So why is this sense of teamwork needed? Why are people shunning their individual desires and needs in favor of group consensus? And why are brands, on the other hand, listening and swapping their rigid hierarchies for a new sense of cooperation, like David Ehrlichman says? So I'm just going to whip through three of the key global drivers of this trend, because we at the Future Lab are always looking back in order to look forward. What has got us to this point in time we're at today? So the first one are the evolving demographics. So this is about the nature of people. People are driving this trend, and particularly the next generation, who are experimenting with new forms of affiliation. The next generation, and here we're talking about Gen Z, of course, but we're also talking about the Zalphas, who were a cuspal generation, that the younger Gen Zs and the older Gen Alphas, sitting at around 9 to 14, who are going to be the consumers in about the next kind of 5 to 10 years. So those of you who joined our youth event in December will know a little bit about the Zalphas, but essentially they think of themselves as very community curious. They're on Discord forums. They think of themselves as members of communities or clubs. They're affiliating themselves with groups as opposed to being individuals. And this is leading to this sense of crowd mentality. We've even seen studies that show that Zalphas explicitly want to live under a socialist system, according to the Institute of Economic Affairs. And of course, you know, if we think about how our sense of purpose has been so ingrained with capitalism and individualism, especially in the West, over the last couple of years, or couple of decades, I should say, people have become these cogs in this machine of capitalism. But now the next generation is recognizing that a more collectivist attitude to living is also an anti-capitalist act. And then secondly, we've got the dislocated world. So it goes without saying that this trend is a symptom of the pandemic. And not only in the sense that we saw what could happen when we all came together as one over this shared thing, this shared crisis. We saw what could happen when scientists across the world collaborated to create vaccines in record time, volunteering systems in our local neighborhood. but also in the sense that the pandemic did something to our sense of career that may have taken years to happen without the COVID crisis. So many of you will have heard, of course, of the Great Resignation, which has been hitting headlines everywhere for the last couple of months now. But we actually believe that what we're seeing instead is a great re-engagement. People are recognizing the personal limitations of aligning their career with their sense of purpose. We're seeing people quit at huge speed all over the world and follow their passions, start their own businesses, recognize maybe that they like baking because they started baking banana bread during lockdown. And people are now finding the life satisfaction that they once got from work in other areas, such as more localized communities in their local neighborhood or even in their family. And then the third driver is climate change and resource scarcity. So another obvious one here, of course, this is going to be underlying all of our trends. Climate change is really a principle that is throughout every single piece of our research. And this is no different because we saw as people were reconnecting with their neighborhoods, they were also reconnecting with the planet in new ways. And they've shifted from these individual micro actions, things like recycling, not using a plastic bag when you go to the shop, to larger and more collaborative ways of lessening climate change. And we're essentially refocusing this collective energy that we had for the pandemic on other issues now, like the climate emergency and like social inequality. So that brings us on to the insights section. And for those of you who want to see more drivers, more statistics, more quotes, we do have the full research, of course, in the Neo-collectivism report and on LSN Global too. And I'm just going to be taking you through 3 quick trends from this report. In the full version, I believe we have 6 trends, we have 6 insights, and we have 4 foresights. And foresights are basically where we look ahead to the next 10 plus years to envision what neo-collectivism will mean for consumers in the coming decade. We start to get a bit speculative and it gets a bit exciting. But for now, I just wanted to take you through some of the insights. So these are some of the more sector-specific trends that we're seeing arise in the next couple of years. So we've talked about some of the pandemic behaviors that we experienced almost lingering on, the pandemic hangover we're all facing at the moment. And one of these behaviors that has stuck with us is the revaluing of our neighbours. I'm sure many of us found that we reconnected with our neighbours in a completely different way during the pandemic. Maybe we downloaded the Nextdoor app, for example, where we could chat with our neighbours about who was isolating, who needed food, who was vulnerable, who could we look after. And we took on these new roles as almost like community guardians. Maybe we were walking a neighbour's dog or popping around to their house for milk when we run out. And now these casual transactions, which are typically based on kindness, of course, as opposed to any sort of financial gain, are being formalised in order to reach the masses. So as you can see from this stat, 73% of respondents in a US survey by Nextdoor, which is the app, which has of course been booming, said that neighbours are their most important community. And this means we've come a long way from those days of the millennials kind of ignoring their neighbours and people feeling very individualist in their blocks, staying away from people they live with. Actually, we now have this more community-centric and collaborative approach to where we live. The experience of where we live has become so much more important since the pandemic. And this is leading to new apps too, like Buy Nothing is a really great example of this. This is an app that actually allows you to not just, pop over to your neighbour's house for some milk, but actually start sharing things on a more formalised level. So you can list all of the items that you have that you'd be willing to swap with neighbours and exchange, and they can do the same. And this, of course, means that consumption is reduced at the same time. And if we look a little bit more ahead into the future, what could this mean for retailers? Well, actually, we wonder if consumers' houses could almost become the retail stores of the future. And we're seeing this with examples like Vernden, which is a Dutch retail brand. It's a furniture brand, which basically utilizes customers' homes as showrooms for their furniture. So you could go around and experience that furniture in a neighbour's home. And it means that the person who owns their home can become a host in a new way and actually almost their own retail store in their own right. And this brings us on to the concept of humanity hospitality. Those of you who joined our LSN community recently will know that we did a lunch and learn recently where we ran through humanity hospitality and some of the implications of this trend. So this is all about the fact that if we're already comfortable with visiting strangers' homes or staying in them through home sharing apps like Airbnb, we could see the home sharing market become even more kind of family style, even more intimate in the future. Because as we know, home sharing has become corporatized over the last few years. I can't remember the last time I went to an Airbnb, for example, and actually met the host. You just picked up the key from a box. It was all contactless check-in, contactless check-out. There was no chance for me to have that conversation, learn about the local tips, learn about the local language, and kind of meet and understand the locals on a deeper level. It was just using it as a base, or essentially using it as a hotel. So these spaces are essentially becoming the things that they were invented to overthrow. And they did have, these values of neo-collectivism built into them at the beginning, whether that was, it's all about sharing, it was all about kindness, it was all about connection and community, but we've lost those values along the way, which leads us to new examples. And one I just wanted to bring up, which I think is one of the best in class examples for how we could see travel evolving in the coming decade is Abuelos. So Abuelos is a hotel concept. It's just an imaginary concept at the moment from the social organizer Amara Spence, who is based in Birmingham here in the UK. And she basically thinks that hotels could become these almost like family living rooms. Why aren't hotels these gathering spaces? So she's actually designed this concept hotel to replicate the chaotic space of her family home. And it can become a space for marginalized communities and particularly marginalized artists to come and gather and experience life together. And as she says here, hotels should be sites of imagination, this amazing amalgamation of people who would never ordinarily share the same space together. So if we think about hotels, we don't tend to interact with other guests. It feels like a very private experience, even if you're there alone, perhaps especially if you're there alone. But this could be undone in coming years, and we could see hotels become this very vibrant space for connection. And then as the final trend I just wanted to take you through is Unbound Brands. So I wanted to show you a slightly different part of neo-collectivism, because what you've seen already is very offline. It's all about the physical experience. It's all about the ways we're connecting with people, our neighbors, our friends, our communities in a new way in the physical space. Actually, what does this actually mean for brands? Because if we're thinking that communities are becoming more central in the way that systems are owned, in the way retail stores are owned, this could change the way that brands are run too. So for all these different elements of our lives becoming community-minded, brands will need to follow suit. And many of them will have been masquerading as these community-centric entities for a very long time. If you look at ad campaigns from brands just as much as I do, you'll know that community centricity is such a big part of it. They're always showing, creatives from this neighborhood. We've handed the microphone over to these people who played this sport, or these Gen Zs. And it's all about creating a community as a brand. But what many are not actually doing is building that sense of community into their brand purpose and into their hierarchy instead. So as you can see here, as leaders wake up to the vital roles that communities play in their success, because as we know, brands are nothing without their communities. The brands of the future, or the most successful brands of the future, will be run by consumers as opposed to a central presence. So they could actually build the community centricity into their business model. And to do this, if you're wondering how, it's worth looking at people like Nathan Schneider. So Nathan has a model called Exit to Community, which he's been looking at for the last couple of years now. And this model proposes that the end goal for businesses, particularly startups at the moment, building that proposition into their business from day one, shouldn't be acquisition or being sold off, but the end goal should be to create a self-functioning community that can exist without a CEO, without a creative director. It can exist just with its community who can make those key decisions because they know it better than anyone else in the business. And so to do this, Nathan has created loads of tools. He's thinking about tokens. He's thinking about user-friendly voting tools. So how can we encourage people to make those decisions? We need to be designing better voting tools, things that aren't just polls or SurveyMonkey quizzes, for example. Maybe we could take inspiration from gaming to actually help people feel incentivized to help run a business. And as he says here, it's time to match community-focused behavior with community-focused ownership. So hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the key trends within neo-collectivism. As you can see, it's quite broad. It can be relevant for every different sector. We have a wellness trend in there on the full version. We have a fintech trend, a tech trend. But I also just wanted to highlight 3 of the key sectors just before we go into the Q&A section. So some of you can start to see how it might be relevant for your business. So the first sector is, of course, retail. So you will have recognized with the next door commerce microtrend that this is ideal for retailers to be capitalizing on. So if consumers are building their own platforms for sharing goods and services, consumption as we know it may actually come to a halt because we may no longer need to buy products if we're just sharing them with our neighbors. And we may not need the mall space or the department store space if we can just pop round to our neighbor's house on the street next to us, who we know has a piece of furniture that we'd be interested in buying, and we know that they're going to get commission if we buy it through them. And therefore, retailers will need to shift their focus from selling to coordinating. So this is a really key shift in neo-collectivism. Brands not necessarily being known as sellers, but being known as coordinators, facilitators, agents of community. And in turn, of course, this will boost their eco-credentials too, if they're not creating new products, but simply being there to facilitate the sharing of products. And the second one is wellness. So we didn't deep dive into this today, but you'll see we have a microtrend called communities in the full reports. But this looks at how mutual aid is no longer at the fringes of society. Mutual aid, of course, is not a new thing. It's not even a trend, of course. It's been part of so many communities for so many years. But in the coming years, we're going to see health and wellness brands support consumers in actually enacting these roles of care and mutual aid in their day-to-day lives, actually having these rituals built into their roles. Maybe they're performing community kinship. Maybe they act as someone who goes to older people's houses and looks after them. Maybe they become a therapist or a stranger halfway across the world through an app. And we have these new digital and physical systems of care that allow us to care for strangers all over the world. And then finally, technology. So we didn't talk a lot about tech today, but Web3 is a really central space for neo-collectivism. I'm sure we'll actually get to this in the questions, and I hope we do, because I'm dying to talk about it. Because if we're talking about, all of these pillars of neo-collectivism being things like equality, dispersing profits, community, squads, Web3 is all about these things too. Web3 is the perfect space. It's all about being equal. And therefore, we have to acknowledge the role of things like DAOs and how DAOs could allow us to live, operate, work in a more collective way. So whether that's driving a people-powered internet or even being the form of creating a DAO with our friends, for example, collectivism is prospering online. So the media and tech sectors, if any of you are watching, are well placed to explore things like fractionalization to benefit groups as opposed to individuals. So again, bringing that idea of sharing, the sharing economy into the digital space. Maybe we could have fractionalized ownership, for example, of our Netflix account, of our home, of our spaces, of the things we buy, our subscription services. So that's just some things to start thinking about from a tech point of view. And that's everything from me. I just wanted to go back to Martin, who I believe has some questions for me, and hopefully some of you have some questions for me too about neo-collectivism, and hopefully that's given you a bit of a snapshot of what it means. Thank you for listening.
Gosh, Ollie, that was quite fantastic. In fact, I was slightly in awe of some of the things you were talking about. You know, if we think about when we started looking at the trend, you know, it was one of those ones that you think it's kind of a minor, what I call kind of minor arc trend that isn't going to have such a big impact over time. And as we started researching it, it really became apparent that it was going to be, or is rather, one of the bigger trends, not just for the year, but certainly as we're looking at what's happening, you know, online with Web3, looking at how Gens Alpha, so that's kind of Generation Alpha, and the kind of generation next to them are beginning to vote or to look at political movements. When we're seeing next generation brands coming out of Silicon Valley, the what I call the emergent brand, you know, where they're creating structures and systems that are almost self-regulating in the sense of they're, you know, they're being monitored by both the members of the brand, and I use that word fairly particularly, by the kind of brand leaders, or I'm going to call them servant leaders, because I think that's the term that people are increasingly using, that suddenly this thing is, you're going, wow. And one of the questions which came through on the Q&A, which is an Anthony Topham, and it's also one of the questions I was about to ask, because to me, when you were researching it and when I was looking at it and writing another paper, it seemed to be very close to not just a political movement, you know, one that's gathering momentum, but somebody said, is it socialism with a better brand image? And I thought, well, actually, it is socialism in the current brand image, because increasingly we realize that the socialist model is neither dismissed, nor is it frightening off, or nor is it seen to be something that is opposite to how people in the world today would like to see their political, their social, their community systems arranged. So really just wanted you to maybe unpack from your research, did you sense there was a political dimension to it, or is it simply consumers rather, taking something that was political and softening it out and making it less potentially contentious and as a consequence, maybe even less useful?
Yeah, very, very good question. Thanks for that. And I love the phrase anarchy in pastel colors, I think it was, which I think is very, sums up the kind of Gen Z activism quite well, perhaps. But I think a lot of it is political in the way that I think all of our trends now tend to have a kind of political undercurrent, just because everything is political now. People, especially younger people, are thinking politically about everything. And I think this trend is political and is about socialism and anti-capitalism in the same way that our previous trends, pleasure revolution, I don't know if any of you remember pleasure revolution from a couple of years ago, and conscious deceleration, I think they all kind of fall into the same bucket, in that it is, pleasure revolution is about kind of reclaiming the sense of lost time, reclaiming time of doing nothing, and similar for conscious deceleration, you know, slowing down, recognizing that actually growth isn't linear, growth isn't better, and actually taking time and actually stopping and, you know, focusing on breathing, focusing on things that are just feel very selfish and very indulgent to us. That's quite a big part of it, and that is an anti-capitalist act. You know, I'm sure we've all heard of pleasure activism, the book by Adrienne Marie Brown. It is about how, you know, activism now can just be doing nothing. It's not about doing something. It's not about acting. It's not about protesting. It's not about signing a petition or sending money. Though, of course, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks with the Ukraine crisis, for many people, it is still about that, and that is still very important. But actually now neo-collectivism is a way we can be political, and it's also just find solutions. Just, you know, I can, if I run out of, if I don't have a screwdriver and I need a screwdriver, I can use one of these apps and get it from my neighbors who previously I would probably never have spoken to.
Yeah.
That isn't necessarily a political act, but obviously it ladders up to this movement of, oh, actually, we don't really need brands to help us anymore. We don't necessarily need institutions to help us. They've given us the tools we need to work it out among ourselves, and we're fine with that.
To do it. I mean, I think, you know, I would agree with you, and I think it is a political act. It's of the people. So in that sense, it's part of a movement and part of the shift towards, I guess, proactive engagement in a different way. And I guess that is the basis of all good political movements, that it's engaging people to act for the collective benefit in a way that helps everybody in the process. And I think it was interesting, one of the questions we had, we did a lot of work for the government of New South Wales, looking at issues of, you know, surrounding health, education, community involvement. And one of the questions that the team sent in was, you know, how neo-collectivism as a trend will affect citizens. So they're even thinking about it the same way, and communities' relationships with institutions. So putting business aside, because obviously we spend a lot of our time looking at the implications for this in business, but let's move business aside and look at that core political community, local government. I mean, you probably have a clear idea as well. To me, it seems to have huge significance for how potentially we can rearrange local and national politics in a more collaborative and inclusive. And somebody said, you know, the notion of politics should always be about convergence. It's bringing people in towards some center of populist agreement rather than forcing populism upon them. So what do you think for places like, you know, Australia, for example, where there's still quite a centralized view, you know, each state, while federated, has central mechanisms, and what they're trying to say is that we need to bring it back to the people. So do you think this trend would help them in some ways activate different community responses to the bigger political questions?
Yeah, another very good question.
They're hard ones today. People are not letting you off easy. It's not about, as somebody said last week, about retail or about, you know, hospitality. These are really tough, big issue questions.
I think that's what happens when you know, we use a word like collectivism, because everyone has such a different relationship to a word like collectivism. It can mean so many different things. But that's what makes it a fascinating trend, because it can be used for it can be used for institutions, it can be used for banks, it can be used for educational spaces, or it could be used for a sneaker store, which is what's really exciting. But I do think collectivism does have a part in how institutions are run. And I think this, just to draw back to a previous macro trend, this is basically the evolution of Reformation generation, which is one of our most popular trends. I think I presented it nearly 15 times now. It's all about, it's one of our youth trends. It's about Gen Z and young people basically discovering the cracks in society that have obviously been there for years, been there for a very long time. But we needed something like the pandemic, this huge crisis, to recognize these cracks and actually see that we're not agile enough to cope with change. We weren't agile enough to cope with the virus. So how are we going to survive well into the future? And this actually gave people the chance to start working with institutions. And what I found really exciting about this, and probably draws into some of what people are talking about in the chat in terms of socialism, in terms of anarchy, is Reformation generation and this new sort of politicisms of young people isn't necessarily about rejecting these institutions completely, because they recognize their power. They recognize, you know, that we're always going to need the government in a way, we're always going to need the bank, we're always going to need a school in some way or another. It may not look like it does today, but it's necessary. And therefore, we're open to working with them. We're not going to kind of do the sit-ins like the, you know, baby boomers did in the 60s and kind of reject authorities completely and say, we're going to build our own world, we're going to have our new approach. But actually, a lot of Gen Z are going into brands, going into governments, going into these roles often as things like environmental advisors. It is often to do with the environment, or diversity consultants, of course, is a really exciting new role as well, and looking to change them from the inside.
Yeah. I mean, just one of the questions I have, because I think they're what I call the hard edges of collectivism versus the potentially dangerous edges, because, you know, brands will have to take a stand on it. So I think there are two ways to do it. One is we will see what I call emergent brands. So brands that actually are built from this model by people who are living and breathing and creating things with this model. And then you have what we will now regard as the established brands, like the Nikes, the Adidases, the kind of, you know, big retail offers, that they will have to go, how do we approach this? And I think one of the things you said during your talk was that, you know, it's the difference when you're passing the mic to other people. So that's they're having an opinion about it. You're letting other people talk about the brand, but it's still putting the brand in the position to be the power giver, as opposed to what I think is the emergent brand, which is where it's collectively decided and the mechanisms of the brand are collectively agreed by the people who are potentially buying it. So it's almost like a different way of circulating, you know, potential engagement at the market. So how do you think, imagine I'm a brand like an ASOS or a brand like a H&M, how am I going to either reflect this or adopt it to make me more agile and more responsive to the needs of the collectivist customer? I mean, what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thought, and it's something that has come up a lot in the research. Is that the solutions to this, or this community-owned brand of the future that we're forecasting, often does have to be built in from the beginning, from square one, because it's a lot easier to just do it that way. And trying to retrofit a cooperative model or a DAO model into a coexisting brand, especially one as big as something like ASOS, would be very difficult to do. But that obviously doesn't mean they shouldn't do it, because they're going to have to at some point in the future when all of these new disruptors who are all you know, operating as DAOs and having this equitable split profit mindset in which consumers have a stake in the business, you know, they're actually getting paid to be a loyal follower of that business, perhaps, then actually, you know, ASOS and businesses like that are going to have to quickly innovate and find out ways that they can incentivize people too. And I think incentivization is one way to do it. We've seen that with you know, the fandom market. We're seeing that in Web3, different ways that people are using crypto, offering tokens to actually encourage people to have a say and to maybe communicate of like how they want that business to be run. Maybe they're rewarded with these tokens. Friends with Benefits is a really great example that we've been keeping our eye on for a while now, which is the kind of token gated crypto members club online, which also has offline meetups, which I think is a really fascinating thing. That something is that's all about being online and being very online is now actually hosting parties and hosting dining clubs in New York and places for people to meet one another, which is very neo-collectivist in itself. But I think, you know, creating a community that is a DAO online is going to be central to that. And one other thing that is maybe a kind of quick win, or something that if they want to start, you know, building that, we don't really use the word authentic at the Future Laboratory, building that the genuine community, bringing the community genuinely into your business rather than just through your marketing, could actually be to completely remove your marketing. So one example we saw recently, which I found great, was this spirit called the Community Spirit, which was coming from Mexico, and it's an alcohol, I think it's a vodka, where basically their label is completely blank, and instead of advertising their brand on the label and, you know, talking about the artisanal qualities of the vodka, etc., where it's made, that label is used as a space for community initiatives, so they can publish charity information on there.
Could I be cynical? I'm just aware of time on this, and I'm just looking at, there were a couple of questions from, I think, Olivier, for example, asked, and I'll probably, because I'm just finishing a paper, we're about to launch a whole series of masterclasses on strategic networking. So as people, how we network, based certainly if you think about the collectivist model. And one of the questions here is, is it like a distributive network? And the answer to that, it is really, because distributed networks are networks where there are no central leaders. There are lots of hubs, lots of spokes in it, and lots of lateral connections, so that information, insight, and I guess collective decision making flows through the network. So it's cutting through hierarchies, and it's removing, I guess, the blocks and the control systems that you would normally find in what would be a hierarchical network, which, if anybody is familiar with that, is pretty much what most businesses look like. So my kind of thought is it would be pretty difficult for most businesses in the current form to follow this shift, because by nature they are demi-distributive businesses. They will have some controls, and they will have, some things where they allow the customer to choose. But I think most businesses, as I would see them, to answer Olivia's question, probably couldn't follow this model. And I think you've given us good examples of ones that are exception. But I just wanted to, in kind of the final few seconds, to get your thoughts about how collectivism and how the movement is likely to play out over the next 3 to 5 years, in terms of, if you're looking at the landscape from that point, what does it look like? What am I seeing that's different to now? I thought I'd give you the hardest question, Holly, at last, the last moment.
Typical. I'll give you a bit of a teaser of one of our foresights. Right. Of how we expect to see it. And actually it's interesting, because sorry, I know we're running over time, but when we were doing the research for this, often the foresights, which is when we get creative, when we envision the next kind of 10 plus years, it tends to be the hardest, section of the report. It's the most exciting for us, but often, we have to really scratch our brains, really talk to lots of experts for it. But this time they came together so easily, and we found so many ways that we see collectivism kind of changing in the next 10 years. One of my favorite ones, which I actually wrote a piece about for LSN last week, is this idea of non-demographic futures. Because if we're thinking that people are now affiliating themselves with so many different types of groups, maybe if someone's part of a group for the type of shoes they're interested in, part of a wealth squad where they're co-building wealth with a friend, part of all these different places. Something like age, the demographic of age, which we've relied on very heavily to separate and put consumers into boxes over the last however many years by companies like us, by market researchers, by agencies, that won't be as relevant in the future. And we're going to have to recognize that we're going to need all of these different demographic type, or maybe it's not, maybe it's either we're going to need to be hyper specific about people, because there's all of these different things that make each person unique. Even though they're part of a collective now, they're still a unique person who is part of 10 different collectives, and maybe no one has the same 10 collectives as they do, which makes them a very individual person still. And we're going to have to think about no longer using terms like Gen Z, baby boomer, Gen X, that we've all come to rely on so heavily, but actually maybe some of the most forward-thinking brands, especially, and agencies, maybe like us as the Future Laboratory, we're having conversations about this at the moment, could be retiring those terms and being open to neo-collectivist terms instead.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, we are probably about to retire some of them. And just as a if you watch and check out the network over the next few months, there's quite a lot of those things being debated, with the whole point of view that shift to attitude-based systems and beliefs. So if we take sustainability, it no longer ties into age in terms of, if you are X, you believe that sustainability is a reality, and if you're older, you believe that, yes, it's an ideal, but we can't really get around to doing it now. So all of these things are changing. I think, to your point, quite a lot of the research is showing that across what used to seem random and disparate sectors, so what we're talking about, gender, race, culture, looking at kind of current debates about trans, it's not actually falling into generational solutions anymore. Somebody at 60 and somebody at 16 will share the same values. So I think this is where this sense of collectivism, because it's allowing you to debate, it's allowing you to discuss, to challenge, and it's also allowing us to reach consensus, even if that consensus is quite a difficult thing for us to accept and negotiate. And I think that was probably the point about collectivism. Somebody said it's a basis or a system of adversarial collaboration. So it's where we are happy to debate and challenge. So if you think about the culture wars and what has kind of gone recently, a lot of that was based on the fact that, well, if you disagree, I'm going to cancel you out, or there is no overlap. Where this is arguing that there is overlap, it is about trying to find not middle grounds, but to find ways that can benefit everybody. And I think also ways where every voice is weighted equally and every knowledge strand, regardless of whether you feel it's a poor contribution or a better one, is valued highly. So I do think that that sensitivity isn't generational, and maybe this is why we will see a shift over the next year, certainly in our coverage on the network. I mean, Holly, I'm going to thank you now because I found that really fascinating. I know the piece is even more fascinating and more in-depth. It covers quite a lot of themes and areas that are relevant to pretty much everybody who's been tuning in today. And I think one attendee did ask a question about the differences between, you know, how Eastern consumers, Southeast Asian, or if you think about other markets, will respond to this. And I think that's another area we will be looking at, about how each culture will see the changes over the next 3 to 5 years. I'm just going to remind everybody that you can find all of this on LSN Global. You will find details in our shop and in the communities network. So the report has gone live now, and pretty much it will cover all of the questions that I'm still seeing coming up in the feed. So please take a look at that report if you can. If you're not a member of LSN, you can talk to one of the team. Again, Emily will be able to kind of post details on that, so you can join the network, or indeed sign up to the Future Laboratory Community Network platform, which is meant to be the proving ground for debate, for conversation, for challenge, and for engagement. So, you know, think about weekly updates, full program of our 2022 live events, chat function where you can speak to the team. So think about Holly, think about Catherine, think about you know, Britt and the visual team. All of those people, you can speak to them directly on the network. And we will also be hosting regular Q&A sessions, because as you see, we really don't have time to get through everything today. So many thanks to everybody for joining us, and apologies, I know that some people joined us last week. We did have a few technical glitches, which hopefully this week didn't impair your pleasure and understanding. And obviously everybody who attended last week but missed the main broadcast did receive all of the details you're about to receive. So thank you again. If you have any more questions, keep posting them. And over the next hour or so, we will be able to get back and start looking at how we can post them in the network onto the community network functions, so you can join us there. Many thanks for joining us again.
Thanks, Martin.